probably much bigger than what he actually did. And we view him as a symbol, just like Jim Crow is a symbol. So John Brown is a symbol for the abolitionist movement. In fact, for those of you who know the hymn Battle Hymn of the Republic, one of my personal favorites, that's actually based on a song called John Brown's Body. And the whole idea of it was maybe a little bit sick, actually, but it was basically John Brown is a moldering in the grave, but our truth is marching on. The army of abolition is marching on. And it actually became eventually Battle Hymn of the Republic, but before that, truly a hymn of the notion of Northerners or Union soldiers being all about abolition of slavery. That's what we're doing. That's what we're fired up about. That's the win that we're looking for. We want to make sure that no man can hold another man his slave. John Brown became a symbol for that, partially because he was uncompromising. He worked, though he represents an incredible group of people who worked all kinds of different ways. And some were white, some were black. Many had been enslaved peoples. Frederick Douglass was probably one of the most well-known and also one of the most effective. In fact, when John Brown eventually decided to do a famous raid on Harper's Ferry, where he was going to incite a rebellion against Southern states, and really didn't plan it that well, it was actually Frederick Douglass who essentially told him, it's not going to work and you're going to end up dead. And unfortunately, John Brown didn't listen to Frederick Douglass, and that's exactly what happened in the end. But the point of the symbolism really is simply this, that the way our history is told now, we often think of the American Civil War and the events around it as this incredible victory over slavery. And that's not wrong, but it's incomplete. You see, something happened well after John Brown was moldering in the grave, and his armies marched as far as Georgia, and ultimately to Appomattox in the end of the Civil War. So what happened? Well, we go from this very overbearing image of John Brown to this image of the supposed Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow was actually maybe a real person. It's a little hard to say. He may have been named Jim Cuff or Jim Crow, but the term actually originates for an act portraying this gentleman that was done by a white comedian in New York, a guy named Daddy Rice. And the kind of comedy he started became what we know as a minstrel show. It basically was him putting on blackface and giving this incredibly racist performance of this man named Jim Crow, who he always claimed was based on a person he had actually seen in Cleveland, as I recall, in Ohio. And eventually he had a song that was a hit song. Eventually he gets caricatures put in magazines, which is what this is. And by the way, I should probably say now that there's some illustrations I'm going to have that are going to be caricatures like this. They're not pretty. They're far from politically correct. In fact, many of them are flat horrifying if you really get down to it. But the reason it's important, I think, to look at these is because they illustrate a lot of the concepts we're talking about and why we are where we are as a nation, still struggling incredibly hard with issues of race years after what should have seemingly been great victories. So Jim Crow ultimately becomes this metaphor for segregation and what we call Jim Crow laws, and we'll get to what those are a little bit more in a minute, because this man's character of Jim Crow actually becomes a pejorative term for all people of African descent in America. And it carries specific stereotypes with it. And the biggest of those stereotypes is the idea of someone basically being dumb, being lazy, being someone who is unable to control themselves effectively, and really unable to be educated in a sense. And that becomes a pejorative for Black people, where a person would call someone Jim Crow was calling them a bad word, a name. And I won't talk about some of the equivalents nowadays that we would use. But the idea of Jim Crow laws came out of this expression that was used, and the idea of this is to limit the impact of the so-called Jim Crow, of this idea of this bad African American that gets going not just in the South, but in the North. So the reason I talk about both John Brown and Jim Crow is they're symbols. They're symbols for much bigger things. But ultimately, we have to get down to the history here too, and talk about what's really happening. So this is now a little bit different picture. We're now to an engraving from Harper's Weekly, and this is just after the Civil War, and this is how the Freedmen's Bureau seems to view itself. So to kind of go back to where we start here, and the idea of John Brown and abolition. So I think everyone is probably familiar with this. At the end of the Civil War, we have not only the Emancipation Proclamation that has had an impact, but more importantly, the 13th Amendment to illegalize slavery in America, except when you're talking about someone who's been convicted of crimes. And that becomes very important later. But the point is, right, that we, in theory, have this victory for the abolitionists, this victory over slavery. So ultimately, the victors, the federal government, are forced to confront a big problem. And that's, now what do? We've had an economy that has been based fundamentally on enslaving people since its entire existence. What do we do about that? And I think it's, at this point, is also a good point to talk a little bit about what slavery really is. And one of the most important things I think came out in Mr. Jackson's talk very well, but I want to build on it a little bit too, and particularly for anyone who wasn't there last week. And that is that ultimately slavery is much more about greed than it is about racism, than it is about hate, than it is about anything else. And that's because of the fundamental way in which concepts like slavery get invented. And so if we can take a slight break and go way back to the very beginnings of mankind, we say, well, gosh, if I am a person in a new piece of land and I want to eat and I want to have wealth and I want to have stuff and I want to have leisure, how exactly do I do that? Because as we've figured out a long time ago as humans, it's really hard to do all of the things I need to do if it's just me doing them. And I've basically got two ways to be able to reap the benefits of more than my own labor. One of them is conquest, and the other is contract. And conquest is really pretty simple, and it was probably the older method. And that's that I go and find another person somewhere who's already reaped his harvest, who's already built a home, who's got some things I want, and I literally kill the person, and I take the stuff. Relatively simple concept. It's incredibly good for me in terms of my short-term benefit, but of course, long-term, there's a great problem, and that's that you run out of people to conquer. And more importantly, the difficulty goes up, and then sooner or later, somebody conquers you and steals your stuff. It's happened to really every empire that's tried it. Well, the other way I can handle it is contract, and that's that I find somebody else around and I say, gosh, you know what, maybe I have a particularly good piece of land, a particular reason that I can give you an opportunity to basically work with me or for me. And you know what, if you give me a little extra of what you're going to reap, then gosh, I will let you do that, right? I'll get a little extra, but you'll get a good deal too. And as simplistic and silly as this sounds, it's the foundation of all modern labor. It's really just that concept. Well, that concept works well in a lot of ways. It's very sustainable. But if I'm really greedy, then there's going to be a limitation to it. And that's that by definition, I'm really only going to get people who are willing or who see it as a fair transaction, which means I've got to be fair to them, right? In terms of what they're reaping for me, yeah, I might at best get maybe 30% of it, 40, if that. I'm probably not going to get more than half. And so what happens is, if we think about imagine a graph, if you will, and we're going up the way, okay, how much stuff do I get by contracting with more people? There's a big limitation to it. It can't go very far. Well, these two models, they both have their limits. And ultimately, why slavery happens in a society isn't so much about hate as it is about greed. Because what happens if somebody looks at those two models and says, gosh, I really like the conquest model, it gets me more stuff in the short term, but then it inevitably collapses. And gosh, this contract model, it's so sustainable, but I'm greedier than it will allow me to be. I want more stuff. Well, then pretty soon somebody has the idea that how about we use conquest, but instead of killing a person and taking the fruits of their labor up to that point, we take them prisoner and we make them continue to work for the rest of their life. And maybe even we have a lot of people doing this, and then we have generations who are working and we're reaping all of that labor too. What slavery ultimately is it takes in a sense, depending on who you are, both the best and worst of both conquest and contract, and it puts them together in a model that's inherently exploitive, that has all of the violent elements of conquest, but also has this business element of contract to it. And of course, what happens in America fairly quickly is it ceases to be about conquest and it begins to be about control and contract. And the reason I'm going through all that back example, and I'm sorry if it's getting a little long, is that fundamentally what's necessary to keep slavery in business is control. It's the idea that there are two different sets of people, and one of them inherently are supposed to be enslaved, and one of them inherently are supposed to be in control. And that's exactly what we have in the South at the time of the Civil War and the end of it. We've got a system that's been in place at that point already for well over a century, a system that relies on that exact notion, on there being very different kinds of people and them having very different senses of relative control, right? So what happens then when the federal government comes in and says, what do we do next? Well, they establish this thing called the Freedmen's Bureau, and this becomes the core of what we call Reconstruction in America. Reconstruction didn't last very long, and in fact, it wasn't really supposed to. But what it's basically about is the idea that the federal government comes in and tries to figure out a way to give Black people in the South real opportunities. Because of course, imagine yourself as a recently freed enslaved person. What exactly do you have to go start your new life? How exactly do you do that? You're part of an economy that has never compensated you for your labor. You're part of an economy that has never allowed you to accumulate any wealth, has never given you any power or self-determination, has in some cases made even educating you illegal. And of course, this goes to your whole family as well. So what do you do about it? Well, the Freedmen's Bureau saw itself in a very noble light in terms of what it did about it. So I want to briefly look at this image a little bit, and I think that we ought to notice a couple of things here. So what the Freedmen's Bureau is doing is basically coming in trying to organize opportunities for formerly enslaved peoples in the South to get jobs, get land, be able to have occupation and income, be able to have some kind of a social standing established. But of course, the problem is, where exactly is all this going to come from? And so you end up with all these guys on the left, for those of you looking at this, are intended to represent the sort of former Confederacy. And in fact, you'll notice many of them are in old Confederate military uniforms. They have weapons. Interestingly, all the people on the right are clearly meant to represent people who were in slavery. Some of them actually have Union Army uniforms, others don't. Several of them are armed. And then we have this gentleman in the middle who is, of course, his head is backed up by an American flag. He is Mr. Knight in shining armor, right? And that metaphor, I think, is very deliberate here. And he is supposedly the Freedmen's Bureau. And of course, he's not even armed. He just sticks his hand up and he says something. We don't know what. This is how the Freedmen's Bureau viewed itself. And this was how people in the North tended to view it. And it becomes important later for a couple of things that I want to highlight now. One is, notice that the man who is in theory keeping the peace and creating this peaceful transfer of power is the only guy in the picture who's not actually armed. Also notice he's the only guy in the picture who isn't with anybody else. This becomes very important. You see, he's not joining the people who had been slaves on the right. He's not joining the former Confederates on the left, but he's actually trying to separate the two. And this is a powerful metaphor for where Reconstruction ultimately ends up. It ends up with two things, right, that are key here. And one of them is the fact that it does basically very little good at actually righting the wrongs of chattel slavery, and was probably doomed from the start in terms of even trying. And secondly, that it develops this complex that still exists in cities, still exists here in the North, that in fact, this whole thing was basically a Southern problem, right? And that the North can come in and solve it and give it a solution. Now, here's how other people, particularly those in the South, but some in the North as well, viewed the Freedmen's Bureau. This was a cartoon that was widely circulated a little bit after the Civil War. And of course, it contains awful stereotype to it. But I think it's important to view, because one of the things it lets us know is that politics doesn't change that much. And I'm not sure how well some folks may be able to read it, but I'll basically give you the Cliff's Notes, which is it's all about the notion that the Freedmen's Bureau is really there to give away entitlement money to these former slaves, and they're simply lazy and they don't want to work, and this is nothing more than a redistribution of wealth. And in fact, if you are able to see in the upper left-hand corner, we even have a Bible verse, and it's in the sweat of thy face thou shalt eat thy bread, from Genesis. And we see white people toiling away at their labors, having all of this difficulty. And then we see this caricature of a Black man who is lounging, right? But also both animal and human, depicted in many ways similarly to how the Nazis would depict Jewish people during the Holocaust and in the early propaganda, and for a specific reason, right? The idea being that these poor whites in the South are the ones that have had to hold everything together all this time. They're the ones who are having to work, and now we're not valuing that in some way. So the Freedmen's Bureau is, shall we say, less than popular. And of course, there's a key event that happens that makes it less than effective. Many of the key elements around this whole idea of trying to impose a new social order in the South come out of folks like Lincoln and many Republicans in Congress. Now, the problem becomes when, of course, Lincoln is assassinated and suddenly Andrew Johnson comes in, who is a Democrat from Tennessee and has a very different view. And Reconstruction effectively shuts down in many key ways. Resources start going away. We don't see the same commitment to trying to actually change or topple social structures. And that causes some very scary things to happen. And so now let's get into some specifics, right? Now we've got some good laws that are going to come up for me as a lawyer to talk about. So what the Southern states both wanted to do and got to do was to preserve their social order. And again, once you have the business of slavery, it becomes part of your economy and it becomes essential to your social order. So imagine that you're in the South, it's after the Civil War, your economy is shattered, everything about your social order has been turned on its head, and you say, gosh, what do I do about this? Well, of course, you're going to try to look for ways to put that social order back. And understand that at this time, and this wasn't just true of the South, you know, the United States was a country that was steeped in white supremacy. It was steeped in male supremacy. It was steeped in the supremacy of Europeans versus Native Americans. This impacted the whole worldview of the country and the people within it. And so now when we look at this, it can seem like something that is just absolutely foreign as a concept, but in reality, it's very much homegrown, and that should hit home hard. It's meant to. The fact is, this kind of social order was very endemic to America. But if I'm in the South after the Civil War, what do I do to preserve it? Well, what I do is I break down slavery as an institution into its parts. And even if now the 13th Amendment tells me, oh gosh, okay, I can't own a person anymore, and I really wanted to, I can't. But maybe I can preserve both that social order and my ability to be really greedy and profit on it. For me to be the plantation owner, as it were, and for somebody else to do the work. So the first thing that starts getting passed in Southern states are what we call vagrancy laws. And a vagrancy law is basically what it sounds like. And in fact, the example I use that if this may sound a little ridiculous, but one of my favorite old awful action movies is the first Rambo, First Blood. And for those of you who remember it, what happens to John Rambo? He is a Vietnam veteran. He's struggling. He's trying to find a friend. He's basically hitchhiking in the Pacific Northwest, and he comes into a town. And what do? They arrest him for vagrancy. And the reason I bring that up, even though it has something, it otherwise has nothing to do with this, is it's actually a very accurate portrayal of how vagrancy laws tend to be used. What a vagrancy law does is basically make it illegal to be a person who's not employed in that community. It is a law that's designed to get rid of somebody who's viewed as a bum, viewed as scummy, viewed as dirty, viewed as poor. Any of these things. It's an anti-poverty law. But when you put it on the books and you use it at the time Southern states used it, it's extremely effective, because what it meant was that if I am, let's say, a Black man who has recently been freed from slavery, and I want to figure out what to do next, well, the vagrancy law means that I actually have to be employed with somebody. Otherwise, I can literally be sent to jail. And of course, you combine the vagrancy law with the fact that at that time, you tended not to send people to prison. You tended to sentence them to things like hard labor. You tended to put them into work groups. And it just so happens that you could contract those work groups out to things like factories or plantations. And it just so happens that there were lots of opportunities to do that, because those are all the places where enslaved peoples used to work. And all you've got to do to make the vagrancy law very effective is say, well, gosh, you can either go contract to work in these places anyway, or we can arrest you and make you do it for free. And of course, the wages weren't exactly good. And it's because the law ensured they didn't have to be. That comes then to apprenticeship laws. And an apprenticeship law was basically a way not only to force adults to still work in a particular place or way, but to force kids to do it too. And the way an apprenticeship law worked, it took advantage of the idea of saying, well, gosh, if you have kids and there are no schools for them and they're going to get into trouble, we must do something. We must make sure that all of these kids have a trade that they can work in. And of course, this was incredibly hypocritical as a pretext, just like vagrancy laws. But the idea of the pretext was, if I'm now the whites in control of a place like South Carolina, what I get to do is very simply say, well, gosh, any young African-American child, I've got to make sure that they're apprenticed to somebody. And darn it, you know what? There are all of these opportunities in farm labor and in all kinds of other similar things on all of these various plantations, small factories, you name it. And so apprenticeship laws were actually used to compel often fathers or mothers to sign for their children that they would work at a particular place until adulthood or sometimes later. They were used also by courts, because if you, kind of like the vagrancy law, if you're able to basically say somebody's in need of something and gosh, they don't have a job, they don't have anything, well, we'll find one for you. Oh, my poor orphan over here, we're going to make sure you have a position. And these were used to essentially put people back into virtually the same situation they were in. This led to something bigger that we call black codes. And vagrancy laws and apprenticeship laws are part of this, but then this expanded. And it expanded into things that were even more cunning ways to preserve the business of slavery, essentially by another name. And what an occupation tax did was use a state's ability to regulate commerce so as to make sure that if I'm an African American and I want to do something other than be, most of these states allowed you to be either a farmer or a laborer for free, but any further profession, you had to pay a tax. And it might be $10, it might be $100. And it was similar to professional dues we pay today as things like lawyers and doctors, only for a far more horrible purpose. And of course, the idea being that if you've got folks who want to transition out of farm labor on the same plantation, perhaps where they were once enslaved, this provides yet another barrier against that. And it functionally means that I have to stay in that particular position and I get paid whatever people are willing to pay me. But, you know, what if I move? What if somebody would give me a little more? Well, most southern states think of that pretty fast. And then we get anti-enticement laws. And an anti-enticement law basically says if you've got a person who's under contract and they're working somewhere, it is illegal to go offer them more money to work anywhere else. So what that did is effectively freeze wages at whatever minimal amount that property owners set right after the Civil War. Because keep in mind now, if I'm a person who has my freedom now, at least on paper, but I can't enter into any other job than being a farm laborer, And I have to be under contract somewhere, because if I'm not, I'm going to be arrested for vagrancy and probably essentially contracted out as free labor in chains, just like I was before the Civil War. And my other choice is to stay under contract, work for next to nothing, knowing that there's no way anyone can ever offer me more money. So I'm basically stuck. As if this weren't enough, Southern states keep going further, just in case, right? To catch those last exceptions, anyone who manages to work themselves out of these kinds of circumstances. And that's when we get things like segregated criminal codes and courts. And states like Mississippi, for instance, took these codes very directly from what they called their slave codes, and literally stuck one word where another had been in some cases. And what these created were a variety of segregated, literally segregated courts and segregated sentencing. So that, for instance, many crimes such as, let me think of some examples here, rebellion, arson, burglary, assaulting a white woman was a common one, carried penalties such as death if you were Black, if you were in this particular court system. But if you weren't, it did not. Then you finally had very common prohibitions on things like owning firearms, liquor, interstate travel bonds. And what an interstate travel bond was the idea that if I am an African American, whether I'm former slave or not in the South, and I want to travel from, let's say, Georgia to Mississippi, I have to actually post a bond when I enter that new state that I will exhibit good behavior. Which also is why, by the way, at this point in time, we don't yet have what we come to think of later as Jim Crow laws, like segregated washrooms at a gas station or segregated rooms at a hotel, because frankly, people couldn't even access those things to the extent they existed. And finally, we have no sale provisions. And no sale provisions were incredibly, horribly cunning. So just in case a person managed to work for themselves, or perhaps many former enslaved peoples got together and they were able to produce something on their own farm, a no sale provision made it illegal for a Black person in the South to sell produce or equipment or pretty much anything else without a document showing that they had written permission from a white person. Officially, this was about regulating commerce. And the idea behind it was, well, gosh, if Black people were former slaves and they have no stuff, any stuff they have must have been stolen. So we have to have this law to make sure that we don't have stolen things being sold. That's the official justification, essentially. Of course, in reality, it's simply another way to make sure that people cannot work themselves out of where they've been, that the social order stays intact. And that social order at that time is whites are in power, Blacks are oppressed. The white people get the benefits of the labor, the Black people do it. And this continued throughout the South, and Reconstruction did very little about it. So how did we get then from that to Jim Crow? And a couple of things here. One is Reconstruction Ends. And what Reconstruction really meant in the late 1860s and early 1870s was scrutiny from the federal government, and literally troops in many cases. And it imposed some limits on what Southern states could do. But as, of course, what we all see from what we just talked about, the limits really only meant that states couldn't do it overtly. They could recreate slavery itself as long as they did it through all these little incremental steps that in some cases officially were, in some cases, flatly race neutral. In other cases, yes, they discriminated, but at that time, there was no law against simply discriminating. The 13th Amendment had been passed. The 14th had not yet come into force as being understood to prohibit all discrimination or enforce equality in a larger legal sense. That didn't happen for many more decades. But there was still this scrutiny that said, at least you've got to be a little bit obfuscated about it. So what happens, though, in 1876 is we end up with this disputed election where ultimately Rutherford B. Hayes is elected president in this very disputed election. It takes a thing called the Compromise of 1877 to actually get a vote in the House to make this happen. And President Hayes is a Republican, but the reason it's so disputed is Democrats have gained power again in the South. And so basically Hayes has to promise that he will end the last of Reconstruction in exchange for having the presidency. And it's exactly what happens. The last federal troops are withdrawn in early 1877, and this marks the rise and victory of folks that we call the Redeemers. And the Redeemers are basically the people who said, it is my job to redeem the South from the defeat of the Civil War. The Redeemers were those who were taking back white power in state legislatures and state government. They were very much the people who created the Ku Klux Klan and other institutions of violence to enforce this doctrine. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But what the end of Reconstruction meant is now states no longer had to have these codes that only referred to very specific things, like could you sell something, could you be under contract? Now they were effectively free to restrict very basic movement and relationships for people of color. And so we get the classic example of Jim Crow, the idea of segregation. And this picture is actually one from my home state of Oklahoma. And to tell you a very brief story, at my elementary school when I was a kid, we had a fountain set up a lot like this, actually. It had been updated some, but it still had this one kind of ratty looking old drinking fountain next to a new one with this pipe going between. And we never really knew what that was about as kids until finally one day, and I do not remember when, somebody finally told us, well, back when this building was segregated, that's what we had. You had a white and you had a colored. And similarly, I even went and attended a special program when I was in school in Enid, Oklahoma, that was in fact at a school building that was in a part of town I'd never been to, that I had never heard of being used as a school. And I thought, this is kind of strange, until somebody told me, well, this used to be the black school back when Enid schools were segregated. Jim Crow touched every aspect of life, schooling being one of the most obvious examples. Many of us know it from things like the Brown v. Board of Education case, but it touched every aspect of life in terms of going to get a meal, going to a grocery store, going to a hotel, and very much on where one could live. And that's part of why Jim Crow becomes such a pervasive both symbol and also very real way to preserve the social order. Because what it means is, yet again, if I want to change this order, I have yet more barriers to do it. And Jim Crow laws or segregation laws don't just include all of the same kinds of things we saw in the black codes, but they effectively expand them. Now, I'm not going to go too much into some of the history of what ultimately takes down this particular kind of segregation, but for a couple of things first that I think we should talk about. And that's, of course, to preserve that social order, there has to be a side that is even darker and more horrifying than the side we're already talking about. As scary as that is, it's the truth. Even when we're talking about laws that resemble and in some cases actually form some of the basis for things like the Nazi Nuremberg laws, we're still not talking about the really horrible side, because that's something that happened in a very different way. Because of course, if I'm the people in power and I'm doing this for decades, well, just like with slavery, begetting abolitionists, begetting those who would run away, and ultimately begetting the Underground Railroad and things like that. Well, similarly, Jim Crow and segregation beget a lot of backlash. A lot of folks who say, maybe this isn't how the way we should do it. And that's where we get to something that, I'll warn you, is a bit graphic, but I've tried to make these small, so it's not as bad. That's where we get to the phenomenon of violence, and particularly of lynchings. Lynchings become not only a Southern thing, but a Northern thing. They touch almost everywhere in the US. Many of the early ones start in the 1890s, 1900s. They go disturbingly close to the modern day. But if you will, the peak was reached throughout the 19-teens into the 1920s. And I don't want to belabor this too much, and Reggie touched on it a little bit as well, but to say that often we have really a misleading idea of what lynchings were and what they were all about. And our idea often comes from this notion that, well, this is something that's perpetrated in the dead of night. It's perpetrated by people with either masks or bags over their head, whether they're part of the Ku Klux Klan or something a little bit different. It's perpetrated by people with some level of secrecy and vigilantism to it. But I brought a few pictures in that illustrate how wrong that is a lot of the time. And the reality that in many communities, lynchings were very public, were very sanctioned by local authorities and even state authorities, and were events. And this is something, again, that Reggie touched on a little bit, but I want to expand on, because it's important to understand that lynchings weren't just violence, they were organized violence. They were an example of violence used for a very particular purpose. And that was the idea of, what do you do to make an example of anyone you perceive as bucking that social order? What do you do to try to deter people from speaking up? And often the crowds at lynchings, it wasn't just about the effect of a lynching on somebody who was Black. It was also sometimes about the effect of a lynching on people who were white, but didn't agree with what was going on. The idea that if we fight these battles, they're going to be more violent. The two pictures you have in front of you are both lynchings that actually happened in the North, by the way. In fact, all four, I'm going to show two more pictures. All of them are that. And they're very indicative of how these often worked. And both of these are from is actually a phenomenon that got going in the early 1900s. That was, communities would actually put lynchings, they would have professional photographers photograph these events, and they would put them on postcards or other forms of memorabilia to actually promote the community. In the same way that, imagine going to an airport in Cleveland and seeing a picture of something with the Cleveland Indians on it, not for much longer, but under their new name as well, perhaps soon. Or of course, here in Milwaukee, we might have something of, here's Miller Park, except not for much longer either. But the point is, this idea is ingrained in communities that we promote ourselves. And all through America, through the 19-teens and the 20s, communities kept feeling that one of the best ways to promote themselves was the idea that they adhered to this traditional social order. Come here and it will be a place where we handle things the way we think you want us to do it. And that means keeping the whites in control and keeping everyone else not in control. And often using violence on anywhere else or anyone else who disagrees. And I apologize that one of these is the most graphic I'm going to show. But the picture on the left, on the upper left, was not from Mississippi. It was not from Georgia. It was actually from Duluth, which I think you only refer to as the South if you're from probably Ontario or something like that. And it was a very famous lynching in Duluth that involved several thousand white residents, actually. And like many lynchings, many of these have the same basic concept behind them. And it isn't just vigilante justice. It isn't this idea that says someone's dangerous to the community, they've committed a crime, we've got to do something. When a crime was involved, it was almost invariably a very specific type of crime. And it was a type of crime that dealt with what we call, or what people in the South called, miscegenation. The idea basically of a Black person and a white person having a relationship. And often what would happen in these lynchings was the rumor would get started that invariably some young African-American man had somehow come on to some innocent white woman. And usually the rumor ultimately involves some allegation of rape. In most circumstances that I'm aware of in lynchings, usually nothing like that ever happened, much less involve the people who were lynched. But the point was never about a particular crime or even rumored crime. It was about the idea of social control and the idea that you keep people separate because that preserves the system that we've always had. This picture here, I think, was from Cairo, Illinois, if I remember correctly, the picture on the right. And again, it depicts an event where the earliest electric lights that they actually had up in the streets were specifically strung up just so that they could illuminate this event where they lynched multiple people. These were events. They were organized violence, and they had a very specific point in mind. And here I'm going to get us off of the graphic things so that you don't have to stare at them while I'm talking about this, but I want to say just one or two other very quick things about lynchings, and particular to focus on one that I think is one of the most horrible and also, frankly, one of the most illustrative of why these existed. And it's the lynching of Mary Turner. And this was near Valdosta, Georgia in 1918. And what's different about Mary Turner, well, two things. One is she's a she, and most lynching victims more commonly were he's. The reason she was the victim of a lynching was not any allegation that she had ever committed a crime, which was the other thing that's unusual about her. Instead, her offense was speaking up after the local leadership of the community had in fact murdered her husband and father of her child because he was accused of a crime. There had been a spurious rape allegation, as is often the case in lynchings of this period, and he and other individuals were simply murdered in public view as a public event. And Mary's great offense against this community was that she spoke up about it. She did something that people rarely ever did, and that's that she literally went out in public, addressing folks like the local sheriff who had been involved and saying, "You murdered my husband. You should be in jail," and trying to get local people to her cause to say this is wrong. So what happens? Not only is she herself lynched, but in a manner that's designed to be uniquely horrifying. And it's designed to be uniquely horrifying because ultimately, in the power structure we're talking about here, she's the one that that community is maddest at, right? Because she's the one who's speaking up, and she's the one she is the one they most want to dissuade, or others like her, that is. So for Mary, they don't merely, to use that term very facetiously here, they don't merely hang her. They don't merely shoot her. They make sure to torture her publicly and to do it for a long period of time. So they take her out to a bridge and they ultimately hang her, but not by the neck. I mean, hang as in simply attach, so that she is hanging upside down. And they do it because they're planning to literally set her on fire. And somebody in this group that included, again, sheriff, all of the local leaders, was both smart and absolutely terrifyingly horrible enough to think of this, that if you're going to burn somebody alive, if you do it with them right side up, because fire goes up and smoke goes up, they lose consciousness much faster and they will die much faster. But if you do it with them upside down, they'll feel it for much longer. The pain and agony will be incredibly prolonged. They actually thought of that, and they hung her upside down and literally began to burn her alive, to cut her apart. And they cut open her belly where her 8-month-old, where she was 8 months pregnant. And so that one of the last things she could see, because her head was very near the ground, was her now newborn baby being stomped to death. They left her body as an example. And that example was to anyone not who would dare have a relationship with a person of the opposite race, but in this case, who would speak up about this idea of this social justice to preserve the status quo. Now, this sign that you see in the picture is the sole marker of where Mary Turner was murdered. For years, there was nothing, and the community essentially covered it up, like many lynchings were, once it became obvious to larger parts of America that this was not only not something to promote, that it was something that was absolutely horrifying. So to come from that back to how we get out of the Jim Crow period, and then I'll try to wrap up fairly soon here. I want to talk about the person in this picture very briefly. He's one of my heroes, this guy named Charles Hamilton Houston, and he's often known as the man who killed Jim Crow. And I'm guessing many of you at home have never heard of him or heard very little, but you've probably heard of his most famous student, because he was a mentor and he was ultimately a law professor. And his most famous student was a guy named Thurgood Marshall. And Charles Hamilton Houston and later Thurgood Marshall established the NAACP's desegregation program, what they call the Legal Defense Fund initially. And it was established just after World War I with the idea that somewhere in the law you could find a way to force desegregation under things like the 14th Amendment. And I'm not going to go into the whole history here, except to say that it's important to know a couple of key things. One is that the myth that we have about Brown v. Board in the 1950s suddenly creating desegregation, right? And then we have the Civil Rights Act. It's a myth because it disregards about 30 years of Supreme Court cases, of all kinds of legal wrangling, of at times very scary things that Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall had to do. Like they actually drove through parts of the South getting film of segregated institutions, and at times having to dodge people literally trying to kill them because they knew what they were there to do. It took Charles Hamilton Houston and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund about 30 years of court cases to actually end legal segregation, the idea of Jim Crow laws as we understand them. Wasn't something done in a couple of years. It wasn't something that was easy. It wasn't even something that could be done in one generation, in a sense, because Houston's generation, Houston himself, in fact, literally passed away before Brown v. Board. Never quite got to see it. Never got to see the Civil Rights Act in 1965. But I think it's important to illustrate why he's there in terms of how hard it was to actually even break down the essential laws behind this kind of social order. And the reason I think that's important is because it tells us why we're still dealing with the actual racism behind it that it beget. And the other way to illustrate that is to talk about the Jim Crow North. Now, this is a quote from Martin Luther King, where he says, "I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I've never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and hate-filled as I'm seeing in Chicago." This was said after he actually had been doing the Chicago Freedom Movement, a campaign for poor Black residents of Chicago. And one of the things that we often forget about Martin Luther King is he wasn't just a person who believed in racial justice. He was very much about trying to help people in poverty. And part of that is he understood the relationship that we've just been talking about too, between this idea of social order and imposed poverty, because that's where we came out of from slavery. And he understood that. And so he would often, in fact, his last project before he died was literally just called the Poor People's Coalition. Many people don't realize that about King, but even for him, it was never totally about race. It was about the idea that people who had been voiceless, who had been marginalized, who had been thrown on the bottom the whole time, ought to have a voice. And as Reggie talked about last week, what the Jim Crow North really relied on was not open segregation laws so much as it was redlining and racial covenants. And for anybody who wasn't here last week, what those basically are is a way to prevent somebody of color, or in many cases, someone who's an immigrant from a particular nation, for instance, or of a certain ethnicity or religion, from being part of a community that is mostly, say, white Protestants. And these things have been used, you can still find them in property deeds today. They're not enforceable. You could find them throughout the Milwaukee area. In fact, as I think came out last week, there are only a couple of suburbs of Milwaukee where nobody has clearly verified that they were there. But what they did is simply regulate where people could be and what they could do in a different way. And so much of what got us from John Brown to Jim Crow is exactly that. It's people figuring out ways to preserve an incredibly unfair social order using whatever tools were still legally available to them at the time. So, where does that leave us? Well, this is an image that I'm sure everyone can relate with who's here with me. All of our kids go to school in school buses escorted by armed police, right? This is completely normal. Well, it was for folks whose kids were in the buses in this picture. This was actually taken in in Boston during early busing there. And even in places in the north like Massachusetts, you had to have people who were literally guarding the buses, not only to keep from projectiles being thrown at them, but from them basically being stopped and kids potentially harmed. This was something that occurred not just in the South, but in the North throughout what we often call the civil rights era, and even well into the 70s and even very early 80s. It occurred in New York, it occurred here in Milwaukee, it occurred in Chicago. I don't know of anywhere in America really that there has never been fundamental dispute over things like desegregation in schools. And it's important to understand that because, again, it's about the social order. And what that social order is about is the effect of hundreds of years of convincing people that being Black or white, or in some cases Native American or white, Chinese or white, Mexican or white, and I use those deliberately rather than the politically correct terms because that's what people referred to. There are, just as there are signs that say no colored, there are signs that say no Mexicans. And yet people roped in incredible numbers of different people's ethnicities, perspectives, histories with labels like that. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that sometimes and realize just how blunt that was and is at times when people do it. But here is really what it's about. And this is one I think is one of the best examples of just how recently we've started to come out of this, right? So this is from Gallup, this particular chart, and hopefully people can see it decently. But it's one that was kind of subject to maybe a little more notoriety a few years ago during much of the legal battle for marriage equality for same-sex marriage. And people looked back at what happened with interracial marriage. For those of you who don't know, or maybe know a little less on it or need a refresher, at one time or another, 41 US states had anti-miscegenation laws. And what those were is it made it illegal to either marry if you were two different races or perceived as two different races, or in some cases even to have relationships, right? You couldn't date, you couldn't do anything that might be construed as, what we now call an intimate partner relationship. 41 states at one point or another. And states, of course, all of the South, but much of the North as well. And interestingly, Wisconsin did not have one. So it's one very good thing about Wisconsin, I suppose, but most of the states around us did. And so ultimately in 1967, a case called Loving v. Virginia orders all of those laws to be null and void. It's a US Supreme Court decision that says you cannot restrict people from being married just because they are of different races. And what I want to illustrate here is starting in 1958, Gallup started polling people throughout the country about interracial marriage, because only then was there really any discussion nationally of these laws. And when they first did it in 1958, and they published it in 1959, what percent of people approve of marriages between Blacks and whites? You're not wrong if you think you're crazy looking at that chart and saying this cannot be right. It's right. That was 4%. Less than 1 out of every 20 Americans believed it was okay for a Black person and a white person to get married in 1959. So keep in mind, this is after Brown v. Board. It's after World War II. It's nearly a century after the Civil War. And that's how ingrained the social order still is within us nationally at that point. By the time after Loving v. Virginia, we're still only at 20%. And what is really fascinating about this is by the time we get to a majority of Americans who say, yes, I think it's okay for a Black person and a white person to be able to get married, we are now in the Clinton administration. We're literally talking about around 1996 or so. That's something that I think when we really think it through is very sobering. This is not something that's just in our distant past. This is something that's very much within our own lifetimes, within our recent lifetimes, in fact. And another thing to illustrate about it is this. Those perceptions that come off of literally hundreds of years of making people forced to be apart and saying, you're different, you cannot function in the same place or in the same way, cuts across all races and creeds to an extent. So that even you look as far as the 90s, you still have significant parts of the Black community who says, I don't think interracial marriage is okay. Think about that for a minute, right? Why would that still exist in the 1990s unless you've got a perception there that is still very real in communities of different races that says, something isn't right about us actually coming together. And when we look at this, I think it should remind us a little bit of that first Harper's Weekly we talked about a little bit ago, of the Freedmen's Bureau gentleman, and he's in the middle of these groups of people and he's separating them. And that's something that still very much exists in our subconscious as Americans, the idea that even if we believe at some level in equality, we believe in it in a way that somehow still involves separation. So here's the real impact. Not just what happens in terms of things like marriage, right? Marriage is one of, and perhaps the most romantic examples, I suppose, of self-segregation, because even today, now that many more people approve of interracial marriages still account for roughly maybe 10% or so, according to some statistics, about as little as 8.4 of all marriages, which is much lower than they would statistically be if people were marrying in, shall we say, a colorblind way. Something's still happening where communities self-segregate. And so much of that isn't really so much a conscious choice as it is a variety of impacts of our history. And the biggest one that I think you will hear more about in the coming weeks, and I'm going to do a criminal justice presentation in several weeks, so we're going to hear a lot more about it. And it's one of the most important to tie back to the institution of slavery itself, is the impact that all of this has on wealth. This particular chart is from Brookings Institution, but there are a variety of studies out there, a variety of places who have verified similar information. And for those of you who may have trouble reading it on the small screen, it's basically an average net worth of people in America, families in America, by race and ethnicity. And if you'll notice that the most recent statistic here in 2016 has a net worth of an average white family of around $170,000. Then if you look at the bottom, the line that is a very dark green is the net worth average for Black Americans. And you might notice that it's only about 1/10 of that figure. It's less than $20,000. Those numbers aren't wrong. In fact, these are the most conservative numbers that I've ever been able to find. There are organizations who've done other studies. Pew, for instance, did one a few years ago and found the net worth difference they saw to be 18 times. So that an average white family had 18 times the net worth of an average Black family. ACLU, my own former organization, has published figures that they think it's 20 times. So 10 is pretty darn conservative. And here's why I think that matters so much to institutions throughout our republic and our communities. And it also answers a question that I think many people have, and sometimes we're embarrassed to ask or to talk about. I've worked for so many years dealing with racial justice issues that I can say one of the most common things that I think happens, particularly for those of us who are white, or those people who are white, is that they say, okay, I understand that I see this history of racism. I of course understand things like Jim Crow and slavery, but I'm having trouble understanding some of what the advocacy about racial justice is now, because I can't see examples of these same laws that differentiate people by race, that say a Black person and a white person have to use a different bathroom, for instance, right? In other words, I can't see the evidence that shows me that something is racially discriminatory. Things seem to be racially neutral. And I can tell you, for those of you who have asked that question, you're not wrong. It's just misleading. The reality is, because of the evolution from John Brown to Jim Crow, ultimately to where we are now, like I said before, preserving the social order for those committed to the idea of white power has always been about using the tools they have. So what it means is, if I'm now in a society, well, and I am, all of us are, where an average Black family might have a net worth of 1/10 or even 1/20 of an average white family, then if I'm wanting to continue this same tradition of white supremacy, of trying to make it hard for people to have social mobility, then I don't have to pass laws or make policies or have practices that discriminate on the basis of race. All I've really got to do is treat poor people poorly. All I've really got to do is have policies that differentiate by people's wealth. And I can accomplish much of the same thing. And in coming weeks, we're going to hear about the effects of these kinds of practices and policies on everything from employment to criminal justice to education. But it's why I have kind of said here that it's always about the money, right? Because that's the aggregate effect. And of course, these are averages. And that's important to note. But again, it's also important to note the reality that that creates. If you and I play a game of Monopoly, and I start with $100 of Monopoly money, and you start with $2,000 of Monopoly money, you're going to win 99 out of 100 games that we play. I might win one, and that's a reality that we have to acknowledge too. There are incredible examples of people actually getting out, but I hope this illustrates just how hard that actually is. And so I think that's a good place for us to kind of come into the present and end and get to some questions here in a moment. But I think the main thing that I really want to leave everyone with is both the idea that where a lot of this started was very much greed. It was about a social order that could preserve and create wealth for specific people and deny it to others. And even though we've come a long way, that basic idea of social order is very much still alive in America, unfortunately. And much of what we have to do to deal with it isn't just dealing with overt racism anymore. It's not dealing with things as obvious and clear as a Jim Crow law. It's often understanding the subtle ways in which everything from policy and banking to real estate to education to self-segregation decisions that we all make, whether that's who we choose to live around or who we go to church with, and how much all of these matter still to where we are as a community and ultimately a country. So I think that's a good place to stop us. It's about 8:10 and see if there are questions building up, and there might be, there might not, I don't know. But I think that's a good place to stop and see if, I don't know, Kathy, if you're still the one kind of keeper of the questions, but let's stop a minute and see if anyone wants to jump in with anything here.
Well, I guess I'm going to unmute people. I don't really, but please just, let's try to unmute you all here. I'm going to allow you to unmute yourselves. How's that? And so if you have a question, then you can just unmute yourself and ask a question. I guess I have a question, Brady, and to start us off, and that is, so as this whole process is going on right after the Civil War and Reconstruction is kind of falling apart, was there any pushback from the North or from anybody in the political party? I mean, as they saw this kind of going on, was there any reaction to that or a challenge to it?
So there were challenges, but they gradually waned by about the 1870s. And in fact, one of the things now that I think about it that I think I should have mentioned before is one of the things that's important to observe about the abolition movement and the movement of Northerners who are on facially at least committed to the idea of the Civil War as the abolishment of slavery, right, as victory over this unjust system, is for them, it was very seldom about the notion of actual equality. So even if somebody was very much behind the idea that we've got to defeat the institution of slavery, in fact, I think of the example of Henry Clay, because he has a street named after him, not far from our church. And one of the things about him, he was a figure who is associated sometimes with trying to change legal or try to essentially eliminate, the legal underpinnings of slavery. And yet he was a great example of many people, both white and black at times, but particularly white leaders in the 1860s and 70s. Their idea often hinged not just on how can we free the slaves, so to speak, but the idea of how can we as white people take care of them, or somehow restore them to what we consider a natural state. And this was an incredibly racist view that was incredibly common. And it was an imperialist view. It was the view of the British when they would, when various leaders made comments like, we have to save Africa from the Africans, to justify a great deal of imperialism on the African continent. And it was the same concept. And so folks like Clay were actually actively looking for places that they could actually take African Americans and literally take them back to Africa, in their view, even when many of the people they'd be taking back had never been there before. So this was an idea that actually has had legs in more recent times, having to do with folks who are Hispanic, for instance. It's kind of this idea that yes, we see that person as a person, but we see them as a lesser person. And I think that's important to note as to why there wasn't more resistance or more commitment from the abolition movement or the North in general, really fighting things like apprenticeship laws and vagrancy laws, because at some level, many of your average white people in the North still saw a need to somehow take care of or or have paternalism over Black communities.
Are there any other questions for Brady?
That's his mom.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Hi, so I grew up, went to school in the 60s in a affluent, reasonably progressive North Shore suburb of Chicago. And I remember in my schooling that what we learned about Reconstruction was that it was a time of, depredation of the South by Northerners and carpetbaggers and things like that. We didn't hear anything about, what progressive steps out of slavery were actually ongoing until, until 1877 or whatever.
And I'm not surprised, because I think that reflects the history that these redeemers essentially created. And that also goes into a kind of fake or at least misleading history, often called the Lost Cause movement. And this was basically a way for people who either they themselves or their very recent or direct ancestors had been prominent in the Confederacy to try to figure out a way to make it all more justified and sound better. And if for anyone unfamiliar with what sort of lost cause propaganda was about, honestly, go watch Gone with the Wind is probably the biggest example. I'm not trying to criticize it as a great film with great writing in other ways, but the idea that comes right from the start of this antebellum South is this chivalrous, wonderful age, and everything is just so ordered and beautiful and nice. And then, gosh, the Yankees come and just destroy it. That reflects a fiction, but a fiction that was really powerful. And I think absolutely has pervaded people in all regions of the country at different times, because again, it goes into this inherent view that we have of kind of this social order of people who are separated. Part of that comes from, it's really the flip side, the unfortunate side of what has otherwise been one of the greatest and most important features of America as a country. And that's that we are kind of the great symbol of capitalism, right? Of the idea of we can industrialize, we can come as, for those Europeans, come in as immigrants, and my gosh, we can industrialize and we can create wealth. And what that does is it means wealth becomes a measure of success. And that which is good is that which is wealthy, right? Or industrious. So then if you have a whole bunch of people who don't have as much wealth, who don't have the wealth, in this case, that they themselves created, it creates a situation where it's all the easier to then say, aha, there's got to be something wrong with them, instead of sometimes acknowledging the obvious, which is that much of the wealth for white Americans was built on somebody else's labor, not that of their ancestors or their own.
Can I jump in? If you want to see something that will help tie into what Bradley's talking about, if you get a chance, watch Reconstruction, American After the Civil War by Henry Louis Gates Jr. And that's really deep. It'll kind of help you with that.
So say that again, George. What's the name of it again?
It's called Reconstruction, America After the Civil War and it's by Henry Louis Gates. It came on PBS. It's really good.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah,
It's a really good
seen
one.
that. I've seen that. It's excellent. And that's what opened my eyes to, my entire, education having been just, terrible.
I'd like to share the resource too. There's a book called White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. It's by Robert Jones. It really is good about the role of religion and churches in keeping the social order that you've been talking about.
Mhm.
It's a fairly new book, but it does talk exactly about what you also are sharing.
Yeah, I agree. I've read that book and it talks about, they couldn't win the war, the physical war with battlefields, but they could win the culture war.
And that culture war is still being fought.
Yeah.
That's the thing that I think is both scary, but it's also an opportunity for all of us today. I think to realize that that war is still being fought. We still have a means of contribution to winning it then, because it has not been won. You've had these various victories, but after each, yet another setback. And really to understand the history, I think, is to understand that we're still in that cycle. And of course, nobody really knows exactly where or if that cycle ends. King used to talk about the arc of the universe bends towards justice, but it's an arc, right? It's a line, it keeps going. And you're never really sure where it's going to end, or unfortunately, if it is going to end. Which is something that's reflected in a lot of the language we use sometimes in advocacy communities. I mean, I think of the great hymn "We Shall Overcome," that I've sung it in church and I've sung it in marches, too. And it's we shall overcome someday, right? We believe, we have faith that this is going to happen, but we don't necessarily really know when, and we don't really know how.
I was going to make the comment that the Civil War as a version of an abolition of slavery is not really what happened at all. What happened was that up until 1860, when Lincoln was elected, the South had controlled the presidency and the country. Even when they had Northerners, there was a word for them, push, who were Southern sympathizers like the President James Buchanan. So, and they had, from the start of the country with the 3/5 compromise and everything else. So the northern part of the country wanted to be able to have its own economic system continue and expand, with not having the slave states. They didn't want to have to compete with slave labor. And so when Abraham Lincoln became president, he didn't try to abolish slavery or do anything that was against slavery, except he would try to prevent it from in the Western states. They were mad because they were no longer going to be in charge, and their country had been taken away, just like the assault on the Capitol. And the other part I want to make is that the segregation was so prevalent and people were so worried that somebody might be Black, that a man named Walter White, who was one of the founders of the NAACP, who was, by anybody's definition, just looking at him, white, but it was known that he had, 1/16 Black blood, he was terrorized because he was organizing and raising money for the NAACP and getting it organized.
Yeah, one of the things that people would do in the early days of Charlie Houston and Thurgood Marshall, I mean, folks like Walter White were actually examples of that, where they would find folks who basically could pass for white to do various functions of sometimes sort of scouting something out, finding out information, any number of things, or setting up court challenges. And it's something that really is very endemic to the early days of the NAACP legal program. And their strategy is something that reflected how they handled cases too. And that's this idea of incrementalness. They make these little things. And just to build too on your comment on the Civil War itself, and I think it speaks to something very important that we forget, and that is how much it's about power. And I don't view it then as not being about slavery by any means, but the problem becomes that we assume that everybody in the North, that everybody in the Union is right, here's our idea of Abraham Lincoln, you're going to smash slavery, and that everybody's an abolitionist and everybody's in the right, in the North. And you had folks who fought for the Union and had actually were slave owners, literally. So the idea that it was that clear who was always totally right and wrong, I think is hard, particularly when you look at the Union. The Confederacy did have a commonality where their economic interests, their power interests were very tied up with slavery, and so it became an easy way to kind of cleave things off. But I think that's a very good point that again, so much of this is about ultimately kind of wealth and power. It's about control, and who's in charge, who has the voice ultimately.
Okay, Charlene, did you have, Charlene asks, I have some economic questions. How do we address economic disparity? A basic living wage is a start. And how much does the top 1% skew the differences between the net worths of whites and not whites?
And it's yeah, that's a good point. That's hard to say, because you do of course have also white folks who are very represented at the upper end too, are overrepresented. And so there's a skew in a sense, and that probably does skew that figure a little bit, so that you're going to have outliers. But those outliers are also going to be skewed by other things, and that's the extremes you have on both ends there. As we'll talk about more in criminal justice presentation in a few weeks, you also have an inordinate number of people in African American communities who are in or have been in prison or on probation or parole or in programs where inherently these things tend to make it very hard to have net worth, often because you're paying fines and court costs, or you can't work while you're incarcerated, not to mention the numerous other things that come along with that. So you've got, I think, outliers all over the place there. And that also makes it very hard to actually have policy that easily kind of fixes the great disparity there. How do you attack that? And I think that many solutions have been tried. None of them have been by any means fully effective. I think they varied. One of the ones that I think was probably one of the most tried was basically affirmative action, or I should say it's not gone, but it's not what it once was. And that was the idea that you try to really change things like hiring practices. You change opportunities in education and organizations so that you change the scale a little bit. That was one of them that I think was tried quite a bit. And the reason I tend to say past tense is it certainly has peaked, and in many places it's actually illegal now to practice affirmative action. But it also, I think, generally did not succeed. I don't know that it really succeeded anywhere to truly change things. People have talked about reparations. And one of the big problems with things like reparations is, of course, first of all, who pays and who gets them, because you have people who, in some cases, for instance, I know people who have ancestors who were slave owners and ancestors who were slaves. So, which do they do? And then, of course, the problem is if you have the business world controlled heavily by interests that are kind of still run by rich white people, then if you make reparations and that money then gets spent either retiring debts or buying things from companies that are
Oops. Take that back. Sorry, someone asked me to unmute people and I unmuted Brady.
Oh, there we go.
Are you muted? Unmuted?
Okay, I think
sorry.
I'm unmuted.
Did I? Get back. Sorry. Okay. Right. So, and someone said reparations aren't always about money, but that's going to be a debate I suspect we're going to be having with this new administration.
So Brady, how about the living wage, as far as a way to, like a basic living wage? You think that's a possibility that would help that economic disparities?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I tend to personally be of the opinion that when you do things like raise minimum wages, where you you do things like a living wage, it helps. And I think the key is that you don't just look at it as something that is just about helping fix racial justice problems, right? That you look at it as it kind of helps fix a lot of things. And it's something that inherently is going to be controversial because we are a capitalist country and we're committed to this idea of the free market. And so, that controversy is real, but at the same time, I've seen, so much work done just literally doing the math of how small a part of a lot of big businesses, for instance, those wages really are. I've seen the math that literally if you had everybody who works at McDonald's getting 15 an hour or more, it increases the cost of a Big Mac by like 10 cents. Often these can be absorbed relatively easily. And I tend to be more of a fan of those kinds of things than I think other types of things that happen, such as government entitlements or programs designed to make up the difference of wages that don't allow people to live. One of my really my first job after I graduated law school as a lawyer was actually working with a child support office. And one of the things that I really got to observe in all that is how much, when people were underemployed, or really more accurately, just earning things like minimum wage, not only that there was no way for people to live on it in many cases, but also just how many other government programs would come in to try to supplement that lack of income, where so to the extent that I think folks often object to things like living wage, saying, well, gosh, it's going to impose costs on the economy or the system. In many cases, those costs are already there. They're just often being routed through tax dollars and entitlements, for instance, or numerous other programs. One of the things I'm going to talk about a lot, and we'll discuss in the criminal justice part, is how much things like incarceration actually affect entitlements and having to make up the difference of lost income from folks who end up in prison or unable to work because of correctional control.
You had your hand up.
Thank you.
Did you have a question, V?
Oh, yes. Can you discuss President Johnson's veto of the distribution of land? Land is really kind of the basis of wealth in this country, and how that impacted the lack of success of Reconstruction.
Yeah, I think if I recall correctly, I think the main, he did a couple of vetoes in 1866, if I recall correctly. And one of the key elements there, as you alluded to, is if you're, for the Freedmen's Bureau, it's what tools you have to work with. And one of the key tools they had, or rather didn't have, was land. One of the key things they tried was to do small land allotments. And the problem was there just wasn't enough land that they controlled. And so, Johnson, what he basically did is shut down their ability to and I forget exactly how, if some of this was purchase or some of this was off of confiscations.
Most of it was confiscated.
That's
and
what I was,
there
was
was
remembering
enough.
that.
There was enough that was available.
Right, but it was.
He started doing individual conferences with people. They had to come and beg for their land back.
Mm-hmm.
And he would see them individually, and he would, give them their land back. And that was why they ended up not having land to distribute. And many of the slaveholders were, in fact, women, as opposed to, you think of the
Right.
slaveholders as being men, but most of them were actually women. And it represented a good portion of their wealth, and they were given reparations.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's something that even I find myself not really thinking about sometimes when I have my mental image of what does it look like to be a slave owner, right? What does slavery look like? And it took numerous different forms, not only in the South, but earlier in the North as well. And I think that's a really good point, and how much wealth is tied up in the notion of that labor, but also, as Reggie said last week, you have people who sometimes, you may have somebody who's a very small household, and the person who is enslaved represents literally a commodity for them, an asset that is the basis for any number of other key financial things too. One of the things that also wasn't tried, going back to Andrew Johnson, that started, and I forget how far it went, but Congress did look at, or at least there were some proposals on trying to basically have people utilize more land in the emerging American West. And it never really went very far, but probably could have. I mean, even to this day, the biggest landowner in the Western United States is actually the federal government by a pretty good margin. And so, that's another place where really that opportunity was lost. If you're talking about trying to figure out how do we create wealth that
Well, 40
can get
acres
down.
actually wasn't an unreasonable recompense, especially when you consider that the Homestead Act had 60 acres. And typically, if you had an indentured servant, they were given tools and 50 acres at the end of their service.
Mhm.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Andrew had a question about education. Andrew, if you're still on, would you want to ask?
Yeah, so I was a teacher for quite a while, and one of the things that you talked about is, at this point, just keeping things the same or treating poor people badly kind of perpetuates the racism. And I was wondering, I see the same in education where you just keep teaching the same curriculum. People aren't really knowing anything, know anything different. And recently I just read that the 1619 Project, there are currently 3 states, 2 are in the South, one's actually very close to us, Iowa. All 3 of them have if you're a school district that uses the 1619 Project, you could lose funding. And how is that? I mean, and even the reaction to the 1619 Project, the New York Times, which basically teaches us a lot of the things we've been learning through these interactions, how does that kind of perpetuate things?
So I think it does a couple of things. One is I think it just dissuades people, and in fact, a lot of the things you're talking about in terms of defunding, I mean, are designed to disincentivize somebody from actually talking about really race in America, right? Kind of the real history of it. And part of the reason is that conversation, if it's done right, is inherently hard. Even for me talking tonight, I think about the things I've got to talk about and the things I've got to analyze, the things I've got to show. And it's not easy and it's not simple. And one of the things I really appreciate about the 1619 Project is how much it's really designed at kind of bucking those old historic myths that people sometimes still live with about how America was founded vis-a-vis race and what was happening with slavery and then later, segregation, and just missing, huge components of what was going on that then tell us a lot about where we are today. And, so I think that one of the key things that can be done is expanding things like that in education. But also, I think there's another component to it too, and that is it's actually integrating that curriculum. If we're talking about segregation, maybe we should talk about segregation within education in a different way. And that's that, and this is personal for me, right? What I'm going to say is it may seem a bit controversial. But one of the things that has happened in education in the last few decades is the establishment of really the idea of things like African American studies, right? I mean, February, we are in Black History Month. And that is all very well-meaning and fine and good, and I'm not against it in any way. But there's a problem that it causes that we haven't fixed yet. And that problem is that when we say, oh, this is African American history, this is Black history, then it ceases to be everybody's history. And the reality is for white people in America, this is our history too, right? This is everybody's, and you can't escape it. One of the biggest things I think we see in perpetuating racism, segregation, things like that, is people who simply put it in a category different from their own, right? Oh yeah, that's history. Or one of the most common here in Wisconsin is that's the South. Even when I grew up in Oklahoma, we did that. We were in the South, right? But we said, oh, we're not really the South. We're kind of the West. That's Georgia and Mississippi, right? And never mind that most of our key Indian tribes, like the Cherokees, owned slaves. Let's just sort of forget about that part. And I think that's easy to do. And it's even easier to do sometimes when we literally segregate the curriculum. And the reason we do it is really good and important. And it's to make sure there's space to develop a curriculum that has been neglected for decades and centuries. There's an old joke in amongst history teachers sometimes that write, what is a history book? Well, it's a collection of DWMs, and that's dead white males. That joke exists for a reason. There's some truth to it. And so ideas of things like African American studies, or for that matter, women's studies, or Black History Month, or Women's Histories Month come out of that concept. And again, I think they are great things, but we have to figure out, how do we solve the problem that's created, where then it makes it easier for people who don't really understand this and need to actually access some elements of that.
I think people also don't realize how much of a factor the South has how much influence the South has had in how the story of the Civil War is taught through textbooks, because they had a great deal of influence on what goes in there. I remember my high school textbook had one of those Harper's bizarre images of the Reconstruction that was extremely insulting. So I think, divide and conquer is something that's gone on since the beginning of this country. There were moves to prevent any unification of the enslaved people and their the indentured servants. So we've always tried to have like stratifications of people, and that helps to maintain the order. And you still see that today, which is why you have people voting against their own interests, as long as they think that it keeps Blacks and Hispanics down.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to close it down because it's getting late. But listen, I want to thank Brady for just a really excellent presentation. It really helped me at least fill in the blanks of all the history that I didn't learn. Next Thursday, we're going to begin to explore some specific issues of racial inequity, and we're going to start with employment. So Maria Flores from the EEOC is going to share her considerable experience with the challenges that our minority brethren face, finding meaningful and sustainable employment in Milwaukee. So we hope that you will join us then. Until then, have a good week and good night.
Thank you, everyone, so much.